Hello, today let's talk about Ubiquiti's Layer 3 routing and how to make it work with pfSense. For Ubiquiti's USW series switches, if the model name doesn't have Pro or Enterprise, normally that means it doesn't support a Layer 3 routing. But for some models, for example, the first one USW Pro and the next one USW Enterprise, they do support Layer 3 routing. If you use Ubiquiti's gateway, for example UDM, UDM-Pro, USG, then congratulations, because Ubiquiti make it relatively convenient to set up Layer 3 routing. But if you are like me, you use third-party gateway or router. For example, I use pfSense. Basically, there's no document telling you how to set up pfSense at all. So in this video, let's talk about how to make it work. First, let's talk about what's Layer 2, Layer 3. The concept comes from OSI 7-layer network model. If you check the Wikipedia page, you can find this table. Most our regular switches, they work on Layer 2. That means they only deal with MAC addresses, the hardware addresses, and they don't care about your IP addresses at all. In this video, we are talking about Ubiquiti's Layer 3 routing. So those type of switches, they work on the Layer 3. Those type of Layer 3 switches, they have some routing capability. And in our case, Ubiquiti support inter-VLAN routing. And then above Layer 3 switch, you have the regular router, for example pfSense, for example Ubiquiti UDM-Pro. They support the full Layer 3 routing feature, and they also support the WAN technology, the internet. Now let's use this very simplified example to explain the Layer 2 switch issue. So I have a UniFi switch here, and in fact it is a Layer 3 switch, but I haven't enabled a Layer 3 routing yet, so which means it behaves like a Layer 2 switch. And I have two VLANs defined. The first VLAN 100, I use a 10 gigabit fiber connect to the switch. And the second VLAN, my device is using a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet cable. In this VLAN, I have a TrueNAS. In this VLAN, I have a laptop. So if I try to use iPerf3 to test the communication between these two VLANs by using this Layer 2 switch, let's see what's the performance. Keep in mind here, for the router, I use pfSense. My pfSense box is connected with my switch using just 1 gigabit Ethernet cable. This is the UniFi controller for the switch. In this video, I use the USW Pro aggregation. It does support Layer 3 routing. Have the VLAN assigned to the port 4. So you can tell from the tooltip. It has a VLAN 100 profile, and it's showing green color, which is 10 gigabits. The other one, VLAN 100, I'm connecting to this 16 port for VLAN 200. Again, showing green color. For the VLAN 100, I use fiber cable to connect to TrueNAS. For this part, I use Ethernet cable. It does support 10 gigabits, but my laptop only supports 2.5. So the maximum, the upper limit is 2.5 gigabits. So now let me run iPerf3. Let's see what's the performance. Again, keep in mind this one is VLAN 100, this one is VLAN 200, and now I have not enabled layer 3 switching yet. Let me run iPerf3 and connecting to the TrueNAS server. So the performance is not very good. It's less than 1 gigabit. It's only 2/3 of the upper limit, 700 something. Why the performance is so bad? Even though I have super fast network connection, because they belong to two different VLANs. My laptop is here from VLAN 200. If it needs to communicate with the TrueNAS in VLAN 100, the network traffic has to go first from my laptop to the switch, and the switch communicate to my pfSense, and then pfSense route the traffic all the way to this one, and then back to the switch, back to pfSense, and finally go back to the requester, my laptop. Because of the weak network connection here, 1 gigabit, so it becomes the bottleneck of the whole communication. Let me go back to the laptop. Let me run trace route to see how the traffic goes through the network. So as you can see, when I ping the target, the TrueNAS, it first go to the gateway or the router, which is my pfSense. So it need to go through the slower network, right? And then it's routed back to the same switch, which is 100.100, which is my TrueNAS. So that's why the performance is bad, because it has to go through the pfSense. So how to resolve that? As long as we limit the network traffic among this part, we don't go to pfSense, then we can avoid this bottleneck, right? Let's see how we can do that. Basically, we need to enable the layer 3 switching on my UniFi device. Finally, we can talk about how to enable layer 3 switching and how to create different VLANs. So I have the side-by-side comparison between the layer 2 and the layer 3 switching. If you compare the differences, of course, you need to set up a VLAN. Just keep in mind the way how you can set up the VLANs for layer 3 and layer 2 are totally different if you use pfSense. You also notice a difference here. This is a kind of hard-coded VLAN. That's a secret in the Ubiquiti layer 3 switching. Whenever you create a VLAN, you set your Ubiquiti switch as your gateway. The system will automatically create this VLAN. The 4040 is hard-coded, and this IP address is hard-coded. That's a major point of this video. I'm going to show you how you can do the corresponding setup in pfSense to make the layer 3 switching work. Before we go to the new VLAN setup, let's first check how I set up the two old VLANs for the layer 3 switching, and then you will realize the difference between the two approaches. Let me switch to UniFi controller. By the way, you cannot see my old setup in the new UI for UniFi controller, so you have to switch to the classic UI. Let me do it now. So this is the network setting. Here you will see several networks which don't show up in the new UI. So you can see the two old VLANs, VLAN 100 and VLAN 200. Let me show you an example. See, I chose the VLAN only. So I didn't create a corporate network. It's just a simple VLAN. I indicate the VLAN ID. That's it. It's a super simple setup, right? Then let's go back to the layer 3 switching. When you set up these two new VLANs, if you want them work in the layer 3 switching mode, you need to set up it differently. Let me go back to controller. So you need to switch on the new UI. That's the confusing part of the Ubiquiti software. I have to complain. It's too complicated, too confusing, and sometimes it doesn't make sense where to set up in the classic UI, when you can set up in the new UI. It's a mess. Okay, now let's go to the new UI. Now let me go to setting, click networks. Okay, here you see the two new VLANs I already set up. Let me show you how it's different with the old one. The first difference you can notice is here, the routing setup. When you want to do layer 3 switching, you have to select your layer 3 supporting switch here. In my example here, I chose the UDM-Pro aggregation. It's a switch which does support layer 3 switching. I chose the router here, right? And then you need to go to the advanced session. So here the VLAN ID, nothing special. You need to give it a unique VLAN ID. And the special thing is here, the DHCP part. Keep in mind, whatever you set up here, it has nothing to do with pfSense. So your switch, your layer 3 switch comes with DHCP server. It's built in. And here it's not even, even if you use UDM-Pro, here it's not even talking about your UDM-Pro. It's completely talking about the DHCP server within your layer 3 switch. Okay, so here I select DHCP server, and then I indicate the gateway IP, and here the DHCP range. Again, this setup is for this particular DHCP, which is within your layer 3 switch. It has nothing to do with pfSense in my case. Okay, then let me see what else. Yep, basically that's it. I keep everything else with the default value. Then you can save or apply changes, right? Once you choose your switch, layer 3 switch here in the router, once you change it, you save it, the system will automatically create the VLAN 4040. Let's go back to the networks. You can see here, for some reason, I don't know whether it's a bug or not, because I created two VLAN here, and the system created two 4040 VLANs. I suppose that's a bug, but it doesn't influence the result. My settings still work. Let me go to one of them. Let's see what's the setting the system made. So as you can see, the 4040 is grayed out, so it's hard-coded. You cannot change it. And then let's see what else. Yeah, DHCP none, and then the IP address is hard-coded. Of course, theoretically, you can still change this IP to whatever you want, but just to keep the simplicity of my setting, I didn't change it. I keep the default value, and in pfSense, of course, you need to remember this IP address, because in pfSense you need to use it. Okay, so the special thing is the VLAN ID and the gateway IP here, and then nothing else is special. Before we move on to the setting in pfSense, let's log on to this switch using SSH. Let's see how this VLANs represent in the real Linux network setting in your switch. We just finished the set up in UniFi controller. Let's see what happened in the backend, how the switch do the inter VLAN routing. So let me log on to the switch using SSH. Go to the Ubiquiti CLI user interface. So you can do this, telnet localhost. Okay, we are in. But the default mode is not a privileged mode. You need to input the enable command so that you can see the prompt becomes a pound sign. So that means you are in privileged mode. Now let me first run a command show IP interface brief. So now you can see the 3 VLANs we just saw in the UniFi controller. And one thing the system doesn't show in the user interface, but it's very crucial if you use a third-party router like me. If you use pfSense, this IP address for VLAN 4040 is very important. You have to go to the system to find it out by yourself. Luckily, if you only have one layer 3 ubiquitous switch, this IP address is hard-coded to 10.255.253.2. It's guaranteed. But in my case, I have multiple layer 3 switches, so I have to go to the system to find it out. So in this particular case, this switch has the 3 as the IP address. Yeah, the other things, nothing special. It's the same thing as you can see in the UniFi controller. Let me run another command, show IP route. Okay, here after checking this routing table, you will understand how the inter-VLAN routing work. So basically, S here means static routing. As you can see, it's the default address. So basically, all IP address, all traffic will go via this gateway. Still remember what's this gateway? This gateway is for the VLAN 4040 gateway. So basically, all traffic has to go via that gateway. So then that gateway will route different traffic to different gateway here. And if it cannot resolve the traffic within this switch, it will route to the upstream router. In my case, that's pfSense. After checking the UniFi controller and switch backend, now let's see in pfSense how you can make the corresponding setting so that the whole inter-VLAN routing work. So first thing you need to do is you need to introduce a new VLAN. Remember, we created 2 testing VLANs, 101 and 201. You don't need to create VLANs for them in this pfSense because they are within that UniFi switch. What you need to create is this special VLAN, which is 4040. So let's check the setting. You have to hard code the VLAN tag here. And that's it. Super simple. After setting up the special VLAN, you need to go to System, Routing. Then first you need to create a gateway for that VLAN. So remember the special address we just talked about. You need to note down in Ubiquiti backend. So you need to input that IP address here. Then you create this gateway. After the gateway is done, you need to set up the static routes. So because in my test, I used two VLANs within that switch, so I create two static routes here. Let's check them. The first one, for the VLAN 101, I simply indicate I use this gateway so that pfSense nodes can communicate with my VLAN. So remember, pfSense doesn't have my VLAN 101 information, right? How pfSense can communicate with that VLAN? Through this VLAN 4040. This VLAN is used for the inter-VLAN routing within the layer 3 UniFi switch. So that's the static route, super simple. The other one is similar. We have finished all the setups in UniFi controller and in pfSense. Now let's see what's the performance. As you can see, it's back to normal. As I mentioned, my laptop has 2.5 gigabits Ethernet connection, so this speed is satisfying. Now the performance is good. Let's verify the route, right? So let me run traceroute command. As you can see, the system first reached out to 201.1. That's the internal VLAN's gateway IP address. And then the system immediately visit the 101.101, which is the IP address for the TrueNAS. So the whole traffic has nothing to do with the pfSense. It's just within the same UniFi switch. That's why in many situations, your layer 3 switches can improve performance. Okay, thanks for watching. I failed to mention was the DHCP name server in your layer 3 switch VLAN setting. So default value here is author. But in my case, because I use pfSense, I have to change to manual, then give it a DNS server. The reason is my switch doesn't know how to resolve the internet domain name. If I don't tell it, so my computer within those VLANs can still communicate to internet, but only with IP address, not with domain name. So that here I have to give the DNS setting manually. I believe if you use UDM-Pro, you don't have to do this. Yeah, that's one thing I want to mention. Thank you.